What are service accounts? We will now explore service accounts, types of service accounts, and the IAM roles that are available to the service accounts. A service account is a special Google account that belongs to your application or a virtual machine, instead of an individual end user. Your application uses the service account to call the Google API of a service, so that the users aren't directly involved. A service account is identified by its email address, which is unique to the account. For example, a compute engine VM may run as a service account, and that account can be given permissions to access the resources it needs. This way, the service account is the identity of the service, and the service account's permissions control which resources the service account can access. Each service account is associated with a key pair, which is managed by Google Cloud Platform. It is used for service-to-service authentication within GCP. These keys are rotated automatically by Google and are used for signing for a maximum of 2 weeks. You may optionally create one or more external key pairs for use from outside GCP. When you create a new key pair, you download the private key, which is not retained by Google. With external keys, you are responsible for the security of the private key and other management operations such as the key rotation. External keys can be managed by the IAM API, gcloud command line tool, or the service account page in the GCP console. You can create up to 10 service account key pairs per service account to facilitate key rotation. There are two types of service accounts: user-managed service accounts and Google Managed Service Accounts. When you create a new cloud project using the GCP console, and if Compute Engine API is enabled for your project, a Compute Engine service account is created for you by default. It's identifiable by using the email address, as the example below. If your project contains an App Engine application, the default App Engine service account is created in your project by default. It is identifiable by using the email below. If you create a service account in your project, you'll name the service account, and it will be assigned an email with the following format. You can create up to 100 service accounts per project, including the default Compute Engine service account and App Engine account, using any of the regular methods. These default service accounts and the service account you explicitly create are the user-managed service accounts. In addition to the user-managed service accounts, you might see additional service accounts in your project's IAM policies or in the Google Cloud Console. These accounts are created and owned by Google. These accounts represent different Google services, and each account is automatically granted IAM roles to access your GCP project. An example of a Google Managed Service account is the Google API Service account, identifiable using the email below. This service account is designed specifically to run internal Google processes on your behalf and is not listed in the service account section in the GCP console. By default, the account is automatically granted the project editor role and is listed in the IAM section of the Google Cloud Console. This service account is deleted only when the project is deleted. Google services rely on the account having access to your project, so don't remove or change the service account's role on your project. In addition to being an identity, a service account is a resource which has IAM policies attached to it. These policies determine who can use the service account. For instance, Alice can have the editor role on a service account, and Bob can have the viewer role on a service account. This is just like granting roles for any other GCP resource. The default Compute Engine and App Engine service account roles are granted editor roles on the project when they are created, so that code executing in your app or VM instance has the necessary permissions. If you want your application to access a cloud storage bucket, you grant the service account the permissions to read the cloud storage bucket. In this case, the service account is the identity that you are granting permissions for another resource. You can grant the IAM service account user role at a project level for all service accounts in that project, or at a service account level. Granting the role to a user for a project gives that user access to all service accounts in the project, including service accounts that may be created in the future. Granting this role to a user for a specific service account gives the user access to only that account. If you grant a user the compute instance admin role, as well as the IAM service account user role, they can create and manage compute engine instances that use a service account. After you grant IAM roles to a service account, you can assign the service account to one or more new virtual machine instances. Users who are service account users can use the service account to indirectly access all resources to which that service account has access. For example, a user who has the service account user can start an instance using the service account. They can then use the instance to access anything the service account identity has access to. However, the service account user role doesn't allow a user to directly use the service account's roles. Therefore, be cautious when granting the IAM user account role to a user. Service account represents your service level security. The security service is determined by the people who have IAM roles to manage and use the service accounts, and the people who hold private external keys for those service accounts. Some best practices are: use the IAM API to audit the service accounts, the keys, and the policies on those service accounts. If your service account doesn't need external keys, delete them. And if a user doesn't need the permissions to manage or use service accounts, then remove it from the IAM policy. The service account token creator role enables impersonation of service accounts to create OAuth 2 access tokens, such as blobs or assigned JWTs. The service account actor role has been deprecated. If you need to run operations as a service account, use the service account user role. To effectively provide the same permissions as a service account actor, you should also grant the service account token creator role. Access scopes are legacy methods to specifying permissions for your virtual machine. Before the existence of IAM roles, access scopes were the only mechanism for granting permissions to a service account. Although they are not the primary way of granting permissions now, you must still set access scopes when configuring an instance to run as a service account. For more information on access scopes, see the Google Compute Engine documentation. You can also create short-lived credentials that allow you to assume the identity of a GCP service account. These credentials can be used to authenticate calls to Google and non-Google APIs. The most common use case for these credentials is to temporarily delegate access to GCP resources across different projects, organizations, or accounts. For example, instead of providing an external caller with the permanent credentials of a highly privileged service account, temporary emergency access can be granted instead. Alternatively, a designated service account with restricted permissions can be impersonated by an external caller without requiring a more highly privileged service account's credentials. Application default credentials are a mechanism to make it easy to use a service account when operating inside and outside GCP, as well as across multiple GCP projects. The most common use case is testing code on a local machine and then moving it to a development project in GCP, and then moving it to a production project if all the tests pass. Using application default credentials ensures that the service account works seamlessly. When testing on your local machine, it uses a locally stored service account key, but when running on the compute instance, it uses the project's default compute engine service account.